Despite the odds, some German defenders at key positions believed they could hold their ground. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division had dug in and occupied strong defensive positions on the bluffs above the beach. Concrete bunkers and machine guns formed an interconnected web of fire zones, making it seem like an impenetrable stronghold. But at 6:30 a.m., when the 1st American infantry units from the 1st and 29th Divisions began landing, the Germans found that their defensive positions, while well prepared, were not enough to hold back the incoming flood of troops. As soon as the first waves of soldiers hit the beach, machine gun fire erupted from the resistance nests. The carnage was immediate and brutal. The American soldiers were walking into a slaughter as they were met with heavy fire from multiple positions. But despite the horrific losses suffered on the beach, the Allies were committed to the mission. The landing had begun. The scale of the attack, in both terms of manpower and industrial might, was unlike anything the German defenders had experienced before. And it would prove to be a decisive moment in the war, as the D-Day landings marked the beginning of the end for Nazi occupation in Western Europe. In the early hours of the Normandy landings, Heinrich Seyll operated an MG-42 inside Widerstands Nest 62, where, according to his own later testimony, he unleashed more than 12,000 rounds in a single morning. From his elevated position overlooking the surf, he observed American troops collapse in large numbers as they pushed toward shore. Before long, the waterline was littered with bodies, and the tide carried the dead back and forth until the breakers ran red. For a short period, Seyll and his comrades believed the defensive line might actually hold under the strain. That illusion ended when the U.S. Navy intervened directly. Around 8 a.m., with the situation on Omaha Beach deteriorating and General Omar Bradley reportedly contemplating the possibility of withdrawing the assault forces, an extraordinary decision was made. Several American destroyers advanced far closer to the coastline than standard naval doctrine permitted. Ignoring the hazards of shallow water, mines, and the threat of grounding, ships such as USS McCook, USS Carmack, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt closed the distance to roughly 1,000 yards, virtually point-blank range for their 5-inch batteries. At that proximity, the gunners could select individual German firing positions and destroy them with remarkable precision. Naval records consistently affirm that this bold maneuver proved pivotal in dismantling the most stubborn strongpoints guarding Omaha Beach. The loss of USS Corey highlighted the danger, yet its sinking did not slow the naval support. Other vessels immediately stepped into the line. To the German defenders, this readiness to risk valuable warships underscored a reality they had underestimated. American industry had produced such a vast armada that even frontline combatants could be treated as expendable tools rather than irreplaceable assets, something the Kriegsmarine could not match. Meanwhile, at Army Group B headquarters, located some 50 miles from the coast in La Roche-Guyon, the German command was waking up to a nightmare. Lieutenant General Hans Speidel, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had spent the evening monitoring increasingly troubling reports, yet even he could not fully grasp the enormity of what was unfolding. Rommel himself had dismissed the possibility of an invasion that day, convinced that the weather conditions would prevent such an assault. He was celebrating his wife's birthday in Germany, unaware that the Allied forces were about to launch one of the largest amphibious assaults in history. At precisely 1:20 a.m., the first signs of the invasion arrived, massive parachute drops across Normandy, including the deployment of over 13,000 men from the U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions. These soldiers were delivered to their objectives by the iconic Douglas C-47 Skytrain transports. General Erich Marx, commander of the 84th Corps, stationed in St. Lo, was among the first German officers to recognize the true scale of the operation. A veteran of the Eastern Front and a survivor of the brutal battle at Stalingrad, Marx's tactical instincts had been sharpened to a fine edge. Even so, he could not have imagined the scale of what was coming,
nor could he have prepared for the shock that lay ahead. While German defenses along the coast had been reinforced in anticipation of an invasion, no one had fully appreciated the scale and efficiency of the Allied industrial machine that was now turning its full force toward them. Vice Admiral Frederick Ruge, a naval expert who had been appointed to assist Rommel in November 1943, had long been pushing for more defenses, including additional mines, artillery, and naval obstacles. Ruge, born into a naval family in 1894, knew better than anyone the maritime challenges that lay ahead. Yet as he would later recount in his memoir Rommel in Normandy, the Germans were preparing to fight a war they understood, while the Allies were bringing an entirely new kind of warfare, one that would render traditional defenses meaningless. By the time the sun began to rise over Normandy, the invaders had already made their presence known, and the world would never be the same. What had started as a relatively small invasion on paper would soon snowball into an industrial avalanche, one that would break the back of the German war machine. The conflict on June 6, 1944, would mark the beginning of the end of Nazi Germany, a brutal, unstoppable force of industrial power that would change the fate of Europe forever. By early June 6, 1944, the German High Command had come to believe that the Allies would be capable of launching an invasion with roughly 20 divisions, supported by around 3,000 ships. This estimate was based on their own resources, their experiences of scarcity, and the ever-diminishing state of their industrial capacity after 5 years. However, as dawn broke on that fateful morning, the German soldiers positioned along the Normandy coast would soon be confronted with a reality far beyond anything they had imagined. From the observation posts and bunkers stretching from Cherbourg to Le Havre, German soldiers began reporting a sight they scarcely comprehended. Instead of the expected smaller-scale attack, the Allies had deployed an overwhelming force. Far more than a handful of ships, they faced an armada numbering in the thousands. What was initially suspected to be a diversion turned out to be the largest amphibious assault ever carried out.
At Strong Point WN-62, which overlooked what would later be known as Omaha Beach, 20-year-old German soldier Gerhard Hendrik Severo stood at his machine gun nest. A farm boy from Metzing, Severo had never even seen the sea before being stationed in Normandy. But now, as the first rays of light illuminated the coastline, all he could see was metal and movement. Ships everywhere, Severo would later recall in his memoir. Large ships, small ones, flat-bottomed ones, destroyers darting back and forth like herding dogs. The horizon was gone. I tried to count them, but I gave up after 100. There were too many. Thousands. This shocking realization of the sheer scale of the invasion spread across the 50-mile stretch of the Allied landing zone. German officers and soldiers alike were stunned to find themselves not only facing superior numbers, but an entirely different level of force, a scale of power that far surpassed anything they had expected. At 5:30 a.m., the first naval bombardment began. The Allies had assembled an immense naval force, including 5 battleships, 20 cruisers, 65 destroyers, and 2 monitors. The German defenders had no idea of the sheer power they would soon encounter. The USS Texas, for example, fired 255 shells in the first hour of the bombardment. Each of these 14-inch shells weighed 1,400 pounds. In just 60 minutes, one American battleship had launched 178 tons of explosives, more than the total ammunition stockpiles of many German artillery units. In total, the Allied naval bombardment unleashed approximately 130,000 tons of explosive firepower, including 50,000 shells from destroyers, 23,000 from cruisers, and 3,500 from battleships. General Gil Blumenritt, the Chief of Staff for Commander-in-Chief West, would later testify, "We had prepared to fight soldiers. What we faced instead was a war machine, a factory of destruction." At 6 a.m., as naval bombardment continued to tear into the German defenses along the Atlantic Wall,
A second, equally overwhelming demonstration of Allied power took place in the skies above. Thousands of Allied aircraft filled the sky, a sight that further undermined German morale. In total, the Allies launched over 14,000 sorties in support of the invasion. In contrast, the Luftwaffe could muster only about 300 operational aircraft across all of France. On that day, they managed to fly 319 sorties. For every German plane in the air, there were 46 Allied aircraft. This disparity in air power made the situation almost hopeless for the defenders. Major Josef Prill, who commanded Jagdgeschwader 26, made the only Luftwaffe attack on the invasion beaches that morning. Along with his wingman, Heinz Wojciech, they attempted to strafe Sword Beach, but were quickly overwhelmed by Allied fighters, forcing them to retreat. This brief and unsuccessful engagement would later be cited as an example of the Luftwaffe's impotence in the face of the overwhelming Allied aerial superiority.
Despite the odds, some German defenders at key positions believed they could hold their ground. At Omaha Beach, the 352nd Infantry Division had dug in and occupied strong defensive positions on the bluffs above the beach. Concrete bunkers and machine guns formed an interconnected web of fire zones, making it seem like an impenetrable stronghold. But at 6:30 a.m., when the 1st American infantry units from the 1st and 29th Divisions began landing, the Germans found that their defensive positions, while well prepared, were not enough to hold back the incoming flood of troops. As soon as the first waves of soldiers hit the beach, machine gun fire erupted from the resistance nests. The carnage was immediate and brutal. The American soldiers were walking into a slaughter as they were met with heavy fire from multiple positions. But despite the horrific losses suffered on the beach, the Allies were committed to the mission. The landing had begun. The scale of the attack, in both terms of manpower and industrial might, was unlike anything the German defenders had experienced before. And it would prove to be a decisive moment in the war, as the D-Day landings marked the beginning of the end for Nazi occupation in Western Europe. In the early hours of the Normandy landings, Heinrich Seyll operated an MG-42 inside Widerstandsnest Nest 62, where, according to his own later testimony, he unleashed more than 12,000 rounds in a single morning. From his elevated position overlooking the surf, he observed American troops collapse in large numbers as they pushed toward shore. Before long, the waterline was littered with bodies, and the tide carried the dead back and forth until the breakers ran red. For a short period, Seyll and his comrades believed the defensive line might actually hold under the strain. That illusion ended when the U.S. Navy intervened directly. Around 8 a.m., with the situation on Omaha Beach deteriorating and General Omar Bradley reportedly contemplating the possibility of withdrawing the assault forces, an extraordinary decision was made. Several American destroyers advanced far closer to the coastline than standard naval doctrine permitted. Ignoring the hazards of shallow water, mines, and the threat of grounding, ships such as USS McCook, USS Carmack, USS Doyle, and USS Frankfurt closed the distance to roughly 1,000 yards, virtually point-blank range for their 5-inch batteries. At that proximity, the gunners could select individual German firing positions and destroy them with remarkable precision. Naval records consistently affirm that this bold maneuver proved pivotal in dismantling the most stubborn strongpoints guarding Omaha Beach. The loss of USS Corey highlighted the danger, yet its sinking did not slow the naval support. Other vessels immediately stepped into the line. To the German defenders, this readiness to risk valuable warships underscored a reality they had underestimated. American industry had produced such a vast armada that even frontline combatants could be treated as expendable tools rather than irreplaceable assets, something the Kriegsmarine could not match. As the hours passed, German units witnessed a scale of amphibious logistics far beyond anything they had prepared for. Landing craft poured ashore in an unbroken sequence, delivering troops and equipment in volumes that appeared inexhaustible.
A wide assortment of specialized vessels astounded observers. LCTs ferried Sherman tanks directly onto the sand, while massive LSTs, over 300 feet in length, drove themselves onto the shoreline and opened their bow doors to unload entire armored contingents. Amphibious trucks, the DUKWs, navigated through the surf under their own power, rolled up the beaches, and immediately began distributing ammunition and supplies to frontline elements. By the end of June 6th, roughly 156,000 Allied personnel had reached French soil, more than 132,000 by sea, and over 23,000 by air. Their numbers already surpassed the manpower available to the entire German 7th Army charged with defending Normandy. Within the first full day, the Allies also moved ashore approximately 20,000 vehicles, 1,700 tanks, and around 15,000 tons of materiel, logistical figures that dwarf German capabilities in the region. The 7th Army could muster fewer than 500 operational tanks across all of Normandy, while the invaders landed more than triple that number in the opening 24 hours. The German High Command's reaction exposed not only a shortage of resources, but deep structural weaknesses when confronted with overwhelming Allied firepower and mobility. The armored formations celebrated for their triumphs in 1940 found themselves immobilized by relentless Allied air attacks and the crushing accuracy of naval gunfire. The only Panzer Division positioned close enough to potentially disrupt the landings, the 21st Panzer Division, did not launch its counterstrike until late in the afternoon, around 1600, far too late to alter the course of events on D-Day. The division required nearly 3 hours to cover the 10-mile stretch from Runville to the approaches near Caen, a delay that turned what had been intended as a swift armored advance into a slow parade of shattered machines. By the time the surviving panzers finally reached the vicinity of Sword Beach, they immediately came under the guidance-directed naval fire of British spotters positioned inland. HMS Warspite, lying some 15 miles offshore, launched 15-inch shells whose destructive power exceeded the armor protection of any tank then in service. SS Standenführer Kurt Meyer, commander of the 25th SS Panzergrenadier Regiment, later recalled in his memoirs that Allied materiel dominance was so overwhelming that German strength collapsed like surf on an immovable cliff. On June 7th, D-Day +1, German reconnaissance crews returned with aerial photographs so startling that senior officers initially rejected them as fabrications. The Allies were not racing to seize French ports. They were constructing entirely new ones in the open waters. These Mulberry harbors, an undertaking almost beyond engineering imagination, had been manufactured in Britain and towed across the Channel. The system included roughly 600,000 tons of reinforced concrete, 33 pierheads, around 10 miles of floating causeways, and 93 scuttled ships arranged as breakwaters. Within 14 days of the landings, the Mulberries were sustaining a flow of roughly 9,000 tons of supplies per day, surpassing the capacity of several established French ports. 4 years of German labor on the Atlantic Wall had focused on defending harbor facilities. The Allies, by contrast, had solved the problem by making harbors unnecessary.
Throughout June 1944, German leadership slowly came to grips with the enormity of their intelligence failure. Operation Fortitude, the Allied deception plan, had succeeded so thoroughly that German analysts viewed the Normandy assault as a diversion. They remained convinced that the main attack would fall at Pas-de-Calais under General George Patton's fictitious 1st United States Army Group. Critical reserves therefore stayed immobilized, awaiting an offensive that never materialized. The truth became evident when Panzer Group West's commander, General der Panzertruppe Leogier von Schweppenberg, reviewed captured documents, revealing Patton was already in Normandy and in command of the very real U.S. Third Army. As the weeks passed, messages from German field officers to higher headquarters grew increasingly bleak. General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief West, received a phone call from Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel at OKW,
demanding to know why the invasion had not been thrown back into the sea. When Keitel asked for recommendations, Rundstedt delivered his now famous reply, "Make peace, you fools, what else is left?" He was dismissed almost immediately for his candor. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's meeting with Hitler at Marjuval on June 17th underscored the crisis. Documents from the conference indicate that Rommel laid out the stark reality. Allied air domination, German formations reduced to roughly 30% strength, and daylight movements rendered impossible by naval gunfire. Hitler dismissed all suggestions of withdrawal and instead ordered unyielding resistance. Rommel understood at that moment that Germany's defeat was inevitable. Less than a month later, he was implicated in the July 20 plot against Hitler and compelled to take his own life. His chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, who survived the war, later wrote in Invasion 1944, Rommel and the Normandy Campaign, that the German army was not beaten by superior tactics or greater skill, but by an overwhelming torrent of Allied industrial output. The struggle for Caen further illuminated the asymmetry of resources. On July 7th, the Royal Air Force dispatched 467 heavy bombers that released 2,500 tons of explosives onto the city in just 40 minutes, more ordnance than the entire Luftwaffe possessed in France at the time. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, considered one of Germany's most formidable formations, began the Normandy campaign with 20,540 personnel and roughly 150 tanks. 6 weeks later, it retained only about 300 men and had lost every armored vehicle, including more than 8,000 casualties in the Falaise encirclement alone. Operation Cobra, launched by the U.S. First Army on July 25th, delivered the final demonstration of Allied dominance. In preparation for the breakout, approximately 1,500 heavy bombers, 380 medium bombers, and 550 fighter bombers dropped some 3,300 tons of bombs onto a target zone measuring just 6,000 by 2,200 yards, transforming the battlefield and opening the way for a decisive American advance. General Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the Panzer Lehr Division, later recounted the scene from beneath the Allied bombardment with stark brevity. His formation, he said, had been wiped out. What confronted his troops was not a conventional opponent maneuvering across the battlefield, but the crushing weight of an industrial superpower operating at full capacity.
The Panzer Lehr Division, considered one of the German army's best-equipped formations, had entered Normandy with roughly 190 armored vehicles and about 16,000 personnel. Within weeks, that force had effectively ceased to exist. In the sector that bore the full brunt of the air assault, approximately 3,000 German soldiers were present. About a third were killed instantly, another third wounded, and the remaining men were left in such profound psychological shock that organized resistance collapsed. The Allied offensive was not without its own tragedies. Friendly fire incidents during the operation resulted in the deaths of 111 American soldiers and injuries to nearly 500 more. Among the casualties was Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, at that time the highest-ranking U.S. officer to lose his life in the European theater. Despite this loss and the toll on American units, the overall offensive proceeded without strategic disruption. Between 12 and 21 August 1944, the area around Falaise, later known as the Falaise Pocket, became the final trap for the last coherent German forces in Normandy. The outcome was devastating. Estimates suggest that between 10,000 and 15,000 German troops were killed and 40,000 to 50,000 taken prisoner. In the northern part of the pocket alone, Allied forces destroyed 344 armored fighting vehicles and over 2,000 trucks and support vehicles. Another 252 artillery pieces were abandoned or destroyed. Although somewhere between 20,000 and 50,000 Germans managed to break out, these were scattered fragments of units, stripped of both equipment and cohesion. For the German General Staff, The catastrophe in Normandy illuminated an uncomfortable truth. The war had become a contest of industrial systems rather than military brilliance. By 1944, production statistics made that reality impossible to ignore. German factories produced just under 40,000 aircraft and reached a peak of only about 1,850 tanks in a single month, while truck production hovered around 68,000 in December. In contrast, the United States alone turned out 96,000 aircraft in 1944, nearly 29,000 tanks, and an astonishing 650,000 military trucks. These numbers did not even account for British, Canadian, or Soviet output, all of which compounded the imbalance. Over the entire span of the war, American industry delivered approximately 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 artillery pieces, 86,000 tanks, more than 2 million military trucks, and tens of billions of rounds of ammunition. After the conflict, General Franz Halder assessed these figures and concluded that by 1944, the Allies held at least a 5-to-1 advantage in overall military production, and in certain categories, such as motor transport, the disparity reached 10-to-1. Germany, he argued, was not simply defeated on the battlefield, it was overwhelmed by arithmetic. For many German officers who escaped Normandy, the experience was psychologically transformative. They had grown up under a regime that preached the inherent superiority of the German soldier and dismissed Americans as comfortable civilians unprepared for hardship. The battlefield proved otherwise. American forces possessed machinery to lighten physical labor, expensive radio networks enabling seamless coordination, more ammunition for training and combat than the German army could imagine, and the assurance that immense reserves of equipment stood behind every operation.
These revelations contributed to a noticeable rise in suicides among German officers. Military defeat was painful, but the collapse of an ideological worldview, reinforced since childhood for many younger officers, was even more destabilizing. Moreover, the technological gulf between the two sides became impossible to overlook. Innovations such as proximity fuses dramatically improved the effectiveness of anti-aircraft fire. Radar-guided naval artillery delivered devastatingly accurate strikes far inland, often with the very first salvo. Amphibious DUWK trucks, an engineering niche Germany never managed to fill, solved logistics challenges that hampered German operations throughout the war. By late 1944, the surviving German leadership understood that the conflict was no longer decided by tactical maneuver or even strategic planning. It had become a war of capacity, one in which the industrial resources of an entire continent confronted a nation whose war economy, already strained and battered by bombing, could no longer keep pace. During World War II, the innovative and specialized vehicles used by the Allies left a profound impact on German military leaders. One particularly notable example was the development of Hobart's Funnies, a series of modified tanks created for specific tasks such as mine clearing, bridge laying, and bunker destruction. These vehicles solved tactical challenges not through traditional combat, but by utilizing engineering ingenuity, sparing soldiers from the horrors of direct confrontation. The effectiveness of these vehicles in the Normandy campaign was undeniable, and they were a key part of the Allies' success. Another source of German distress came from the formidable naval firepower of the Allies, especially the British battleship HMS Rodney. Its 16-inch guns could launch 48-pound shells at targets located 23 miles inland, wreaking havoc on German positions. Similarly, the USS Nevada, USS Texas, and HMS Warspite transformed their main batteries into artillery that could obliterate any target they aimed at. This naval superiority meant that German artillery efforts to retaliate were often futile, as the ships could maneuver and return fire with devastating effect. By the summer of 1944, German forces were nearly paralyzed during daylight hours. Allied fighter bombers, supported by forward observers, could strike any target within moments, leaving little room for the Germans to regroup or maneuver. The air superiority was overwhelming, with the Allies fielding over 12,000 aircraft compared to just 300 to 500 German planes. On average, the Allies launched between 5,000 and 8,000 sorties per day, while the Germans could manage only 50 to 100. The scale of the Allied effort was staggering. Between June 6 and August 30, 1944, more than 250,000 personnel, 438,000 vehicles, and almost 400,000 tons of supplies were landed in Normandy. In comparison, the German losses were catastrophic. Over 240,000 soldiers killed and 200,000 captured. The Germans also lost more than 2,200 tanks and assault guns, and more than 40 divisions were destroyed.
A decade after the D-Day landings in 1954, surviving German officers convened in Bonn for a private meeting to reflect on the Normandy campaign. General Dietrich von Blumentritt, who had served as Chief of Staff under Generals Rundstedt and Guderian, delivered the keynote address. He described the lessons learned from the battle as a profound shift in the nature of warfare. According to him, the war was no longer a battle of armies, but rather a competition between economic systems. While the Germans counted divisions, the Allies counted factories. Where the Germans measured bravery, the Allies measured industrial output. The image that Blumentritt could not shake from his mind was that of American bulldozers pushing aside the wrecked remains of German tanks to clear paths for supply trucks. This scene encapsulated the scale and nature of the conflict. The Allies' industrial capacity had become a decisive factor in the war. In the years following the war, some of the officers who had experienced D-Day would go on to hold significant positions in Europe's post-war reconstruction. Hans von Biedermann, for example, became a NATO general and helped integrate West Germany into the Western Alliance. Many other veterans of the Normandy campaign, having witnessed firsthand the power of industrial warfare, became strong advocates for European economic cooperation, understanding that only by pooling resources could European nations hope to compete with the industrial might of the United States. Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, who had commanded German forces in Italy, drew stark comparisons between his experiences in that theater and those of soldiers in Normandy. The difference in scale, resources, and industrial power was unmistakable. Normandy had fundamentally changed the nature of warfare in the eyes of the German officers who survived it. On the Italian front, the German forces found themselves in a relatively balanced struggle against the Allies. The terrain, the strategic positioning, and the operational conditions allowed for some parity between the two sides. However, this balance shifted dramatically when the Allies turned their focus to Normandy. On the vast and exposed fields of France, the Germans could not hope to match the full power of the Allied industrial machine. There, on June 6, 1944, the German forces suffered a crushing defeat, one that would shape the course of the war and the future of military strategy. 40 years later, in 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Walter Olmson, a former German officer who had served as an artillery observer at the coast of Normandy, returned to the site of his service. Now 73 years old, the former Oberleutnant stood once more at the same observation post where, decades earlier, he had first spotted the Allied invasion fleet. Surrounded by veterans from both sides of the war, he shared his reflections on that fateful day.
"I remember that morning as if it were yesterday," Olmson began, speaking with a mixture of awe and resignation. "From this very spot, I watched a sight I could never have imagined. A sea stretched before me, and it was filled with ships as far as the eye could see. I realized in that moment that everything I had been told about our enemies was wrong. No weak nation could build such an armada. No fractured country could orchestrate an invasion of this scale. I opened fire on that fleet, but it felt as though I was throwing stones into the ocean. We managed to sink one destroyer and damage a few others, but for every ship we struck, hundreds more sailed on untouched. Olmson's words resonated with both Allied and German veterans in attendance. As he continued, it became clear that the true lesson of the Normandy invasion wasn't found in tactics or battlefield strategy. It lay in the overwhelming industrial power the Allies could bring to bear. Young military officers today study Normandy for its tactics, but the real lesson, he explained, is far simpler. In modern warfare, the side that can produce the most wins. We learned that industrial power is the true force behind military success. The events of D-Day were more than a mere battle. They were a testament to the might of the American industrial engine. The sight of nearly 7,000 Allied ships crossing the English Channel on June 6th was not just a display of military strength, but a vivid demonstration of the United States' unmatched capacity to produce war material on an unprecedented scale. The German officers who watched the Armada approach realized they weren't just facing an invasion force, they were seeing the future of warfare itself. In that moment, they understood that industrial capacity would ultimately eclipse all other forms of military strength. For the German commanders, the battle had never truly been about strategy or courage. The war was no longer about tactics or the valor of individual soldiers. Instead, it had become a matter of numbers, of logistics, production, and the ability to sustain a long-term fight. The Germans had prepared for a war of skill and resolve. What they encountered, however, was the overwhelming industrial power of a nation that could produce not just soldiers, but the entire machinery of war, ships, tanks, trucks, planes, and weapons, at a scale that dwarfed anything the Nazis could muster. The victory of the Allies in Normandy was not just a military triumph, but a clear manifestation of the industrial might that had been put into motion. The Germans, with all their tactical expertise, simply could not compete with the sheer scale of the American war effort. The defeat they suffered was not due to a lack of bravery, but because they could not match the logistical and industrial capabilities of the Allies. Their loss was not the result of superior tactics, but a mathematical certainty. The Allies could produce more, and thus they would win.
That day, the waters of the English Channel bore witness to the birth of a new era in warfare, one where industrial power would define the victor. For the German officers, who had once prided themselves on their strategic acumen, it was a sobering moment. They recognized that the principles of war that had governed their military thinking for centuries were no longer relevant in the face of an industrial juggernaut. The true power of war, they now understood, was not measured by the courage of soldiers or the brilliance of generals. It was measured in the ability to produce, to supply, and to sustain. The Allied invasion fleet that approached Normandy in 1944 was not just a sign of military strength. It was the embodiment of democracy's latent potential, its capacity to mobilize not just armies, but entire industries in pursuit of a common goal. For the Germans who watched the invasion unfold, the realization that they were witnessing the dawn of a new era of industrial warfare was inescapable. The Normandy invasion was not just a battle, it was the moment when the balance of power shifted forever. The Germans had fought bravely, but in the end, their defeat was inevitable. The side with the most resources, the most industrial capacity, was bound to emerge victorious. In that moment, as the Allied ships stretched across the horizon, the German officers knew the war had entered a new phase. They were no longer battling for tactical supremacy or military advantage. They were fighting a war of production, of logistics, and of numbers, a war in which they were hopelessly outmatched. And with that, the age of industrial warfare had begun, marking the beginning of the end for the kind of conflict the Germans had prepared for, and ushering in a new era where industrial power would define the victors.